Well, one very quick comment. Mike mentioned the soy water at University of Nebraska and Lincoln, and one great thing is that we are collaborating with them, and we have our EnviroWeather sites that are available. So if you want to run those simulations, you can actually use Michigan sites interactively with that. So one thing to start off with. In terms of the news this week, it's unfortunately, I think I'd have to summarize it as more of the same in this very unusual spring. I'm going to start with a quick review of where we've been in the last week, and at least up until the late weekend, actually there was some progress made in many parts of the state, and I think maybe the big development last week were the temperatures. And on the right side here you see mean temperature departures from normal, and some oranges on there. That's been a long time since we've seen above normal temperatures, but you can see especially for northern parts of the state, western parts of the state, we actually were above the long-term normals, and that has been very seldom. We've had very few weeks like that, one of the warmer weeks that we've had. And so again, evaporation was a little bit higher, and some progress was made, and then along came a slug of tropical moisture. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago, maybe making it up into the upper Midwest. Well, it did, and the result was what you see here on the left panel. Generally, half inch to an inch. I actually, at my house in Hazlet, I had just over 3 inches with this, but very unusual, and again probably means that June will be the fourth wetter than normal month in a row. One quick note about that, and I can't remember if I mentioned this before, but we have been looking here at the Climate Office for years that have some similarities with this one. There aren't many because it's been very unusually cool and wet in 2019. But since 1951, we did identify 7 years that had 3 consecutive, close to 3 consecutive months that were cooler and wetter than normal, and those turned out to be 1956, 1973 and 74, 1983 and 84. Interesting that there's two consecutive years. Then we move up to 1996, and finally 2011. And out of all of those, probably the closest one, at least in terms of the magnitude, you'd have to go all the way back to 1956 to see something similar to that. So if you're thinking about at least for Michigan, that's an average for the state of Michigan. It doesn't happen very often where we have all the months like that. One other thing to note too, and it's a little bit of something to keep in the back of your mind, but we noticed that in the last 10 years, especially since about 2010, that the frequency of cooler and wetter than normal months in the spring season has increased relative to what it's been in the long distant past. So we've had 2012 was a big exception of this, but most of the other years here, we did have more cool, wet months in the spring season, March, April, May, than we have in the past. So a little bit of historical perspective here for where we've been with this weather pattern. Well, looking at the weather map this morning here for many areas of the state here right now, we've got rain and more inclement conditions across the state. There's an area of low pressure here now across southeastern lower Michigan. It's deepening or strengthening. It's in response to a big upper air trough across the Great Lakes region. And this system is much more typical of late March or early April than it is of the middle of June. There is cool air. I almost would say cold air, but it's June. Cool air behind this, and this system is going to strengthen here during the day today, and again lead to more widespread rain. The exception in Michigan would be the UP and maybe portions of the far northwestern lower, where we should see clearing move in from the north and west. But for a lot of the state, we're looking at several more hours of rain. Down the lower right-hand side here, you can see our current radar site, or at least those of you who have a video do. But there's widespread light to moderate rain across the state. A couple embedded rumbles of thunder, and that will continue here for most of the rest of the daytime hours before it finally moves off to the east and north. We should see fairly rapid clearing. The other big issue about today, given the very dynamic nature of this, again, much more like a cold season system, or at least a springtime system, there will be strong winds, northwesterly winds behind this, and And given that the lake levels are so high, there's a number of problems. If you're near the lakes, there will be probably some onshore flooding, but it will be a very, very unusually cool, wet, windy day in many areas. High temperatures today only in the 50s in most places, a full, in some cases, 20 degrees below normal. There will be even, we'll probably flirt with some records for the coolest maximum temperature here today. But that's sort of the not so good news. The good news is that we should be seeing moderation quickly set up here. High pressure moves in behind the system here overnight and tomorrow, and brings us to the next weather map, which you can see here for tomorrow morning. And for most of the state, with the exception of the far northern and northwestern parts of the state, we should see a break and actually noticeably milder temperatures. We should be up into the upper 60s and low 70s for high temperatures tomorrow. And for most areas, it will be dry. Exception the western upper and spreading during the late part of the day. The next weather system approaches, and that's a frontal system way up here over the U.S.-Canadian border, at least at this point in time, but it will move slowly south and east during the next 24 to 48 hours, and that's going to set off another chance for showers, especially overnight Friday into Saturday, during the day on Saturday, and then linger on into Sunday, it looks like right now. One little bit better part of news here is that at least the precip totals in most of the state will not be as significant with this system. It doesn't have Gulf of Mexico moisture to work with, but it certainly will be a prolonged threat from, again, overnight Friday, likely into early Sunday. And then finally, I'm showing here the weather map for Saturday morning. You can see the frontal boundary just moving into the northern part of the state and setting off showers. The greatest threat of rainfall after today, probably looking at early Saturday into Saturday afternoon for most parts of the state. But again, the amounts probably will not be as heavy and as widespread as what we have seen in recent time. For the forecast precipitation totals, you can see there is a fairly significant north to south gradient because the pattern that we're looking at is it's very, very similar to what we saw in April and May, with a frontal boundary that makes it through the state, and that's what we're going to see here on Saturday and Sunday, only to stall out down near the southern border of the state along Indiana-Ohio state line. And so you see that's what's reflecting or what's causing this gradient here, with the least amounts probably a half an inch or so in far northern parts of the state for the next week, to more than an inch in the far south. So the greatest threat of continuing rainfall, and that has been, boy, I could have taken this particular image. We could have used this back in April and in May because it's very, very, very similar to what we saw. So unfortunately, and that's some of the worst affected or worst impacted areas, not just of the state, but certainly of the eastern Corn Belt, Missouri, Illinois, eastward into Ohio. These areas are even worse than what we've seen in many parts of Michigan. But that's where we're likely to see the most significant rainfall over the next week. Jumping into the medium range, not a lot of changes, not at least some changes that we would like to see. The upper air pattern here, just like what we saw in May, split flow with troughing in the southern branch or the subtropical branch of the jet stream over western parts of the U.S., with the ridge over western Canada, and then Michigan sort of in between those two. But with that flow, not surprisingly, normal to below normal mean temperatures forecast, and more importantly, or just as importantly, if not more, at least normal, if not above normal precipitation. The outlook is almost identical for the 8 to 14 day time frame, which goes through the 26th of the month. There is a hint, I would note, in the outlooks at the end of the time frame, maybe for some moderation, but we've seen that before, and I think it's just the models not failing to take into account this very, very persistent pattern. So right now, no real signs of a change. And summarizing here today, well, we could call it horrible or just an awful day, gloomy, a dismal day in many, many places. But that's just in the short term. It should improve here by late in the day or overnight, and certainly for tomorrow, most areas will probably be fair and significantly warmer than they are today. But then the second weather system moves in on Friday, starting in the northern part of the state during the afternoon, and then spreading south and east overnight Saturday and continuing. It looks like into early Sunday. Many areas with some luck here, we probably will be dry on Sunday. Beyond that, fair and dry weather is expected. It won't be warm, but it won't be hot. That's another thing too. Looking at the past here, we've had very, very few days of significantly above normal temperatures. I think everybody appreciates that. Only here locally in East Lansing, for example, we've only had 3 days where we've reached 80 degrees. That's pretty unusual, and it's a part of this weather pattern that we're in. But we'll probably see more of that early next week. The next chance for significant rainfall after the Saturday-Sunday timeframe, probably late Wednesday or Thursday. And right now, the guidance does suggest that late next week into next weekend will be another one of these active patterns where we have many chances for precipitation, unfortunately. So more of the same, at least for the next week to week and a half, as indicated here in the medium range. We'll hope for a break, maybe a hint, maybe by the end of the month. But right now, there is no, in most of our numerical guidance, there is not anything that suggests a big change. And with that, I'll take any questions or wrap up here. Anyone have any questions this morning?
So Bruce has a really good question here. So his question is does the increase in off-season rainfall that you haven't seen the last 30 years mean higher soil moisture conditions on average, or does the rain mostly occurs in the fall months?
It's a really good question, and I think the short answer to that is that it is. We've had increases in rainfall in almost all seasons across the board, and there is an increase in soil moisture here, not just in Michigan but across the Midwest. It's noticeable. I've done some research on that. It's significant, and there's a couple of implications to that. One is that the good one is that we're less likely to run out of moisture in the middle of the growing season in July and August, and we can prove that. That's the good news. The bad news is that the springs have become more challenging, higher soil moisture, and just making it harder to time planting and field work in the spring. So there's always, with these things, there's usually always a positive and a negative, but yes, there has been, because of the increase in precip. In the last 50 years, precip in Michigan on average has increased 10 to 15%, 3 to 4 inches in terms of an annual basis. That's a lot. That's a whole month of average precipitation in the summer. It's a big deal. And so that's one of the most significant trends that we have observed here over the last few decades.
Looking at the years that are similar, what does the fall look like in those years?
Oh, in those analog years?
Yes.
Referring to, yes. It varies greatly. And I would say, and one, I don't want to bring it up. That's a very good question. They were all over the board in terms of what happened. Some continued to be wet. Of course, our official outlook right now is for probably normal to above normal precipitation for the remainder of the growing season. Not much direction on mean temperatures, but one I would mention, because I think it is important, it's just something to keep in the back of the mind. But and when I was still in school, but that year 1983, we had a very, very unusually cool wet spring, but it was followed by heat and dryness during the middle of the growing season, and actually one of the classic sort of Midwestern midsummer droughts. So it is possible we can flip-flop and go to something very, very different. It's not right now in the forecast, but it has happened before. But so we've also seen wetter than normal conditions for the remainder of the season as well. Very little, though, very little to give us a go on for the later on in the fall. It was all over the place.
Jeff, thanks so much.